And now it's time for Mob Talk Radio with your host, Jeff Canarsie.
I could be wrong, of the Cotrone crime family. There will be one more next week, and then we will figure out maybe what we'll do is we'll do a Vegas in the mob thing, and then maybe we'll, after that, do the next family, because I don't want to lop everything in together. So we'll figure out next week. Anyway, as the late 1960s entered the scene, Cotrone has a few problems. Number one, he's just walking past the Bonanno issues. And as one issue begins to simmer down for him, another one begins to brew inside of his own crime family. Paolo Violi, who was widely considered his number two, had his own ambitions and isn't afraid of telling anybody who will listen to him that he feels like Vic Cotrone is soft. He doesn't feel like Cotrone is leading the family the appropriate way. It's Violi's belief. I wrote violins. It's Violi's belief that the crime family had become beholden to the Bonannos and more so to the commission itself. On multiple wiretaps, as we said 2 weeks ago, Violi is essentially taking the stance that Cotrone is weak and that if he were in charge of the family, he has his own ideals and his own beliefs, and he doesn't mince words as far as telling the commission and the Bonannos to go fuck themselves. Whether this was merely preening or peacocking or bragging, whatever you want to say, Violi is about Violi has about every single intention of taking the crime family over at some point. And here's what's interesting, and this is sort of a side notation to this particular episode. And the reason why this episode is not long is because I wanted to split what's about to happen into two parts, because I didn't want to leave you right in the middle of a war. And I want to just sort of leave it right as the war is beginning and the reason why. So, also, as far as history, one of the things we always say on this show is history always repeats itself. And that's true in this case. Everything that we've ever talked about on this show, if you go and look, you don't have to be psychic. You don't have to be a mob genre expert. You don't even got to be a street expert to see the parallels between, say, Vito Genovese, Vic Cotrone, Johnny Papaglia. These things all have some very common themes to them. And so when I constantly say learn from history, this is exactly what I mean, because you already know what's coming. You should have already been able to figure this out last week or the week before, or even 2 weeks back, of how this was going to go down. Because no matter how perfect everything is, you can make mistakes, which lead to a chain of events you can never come back from. So, as elections began in 1969, the Cotrones had always been at the forefront of political backing, and they knew who to vote in, and they knew who they didn't want in. And they essentially would stop at nothing to ensure that the person that they want, the person they felt that could help them the most, would win the election. Election rigging, they had been doing it for years. From election rigging to threats of violence, election fraud has always been one of the top Cotrone sort of desires. So Pierre Laporte was running for the leadership of the Quebec Liberal Party, which Vic Cotrone was a member of. Cotrone felt that they could win, and they could also help Pierre Laporte win. And they had hopes, and really this is creative, but this is the end game. They think that if they can get Laporte to win, that maybe someday he's going to become the attorney general. And if they can get a guy that they like and trust and work well with as attorney general, that's fantastic for the Cotrones. It just meant that they could control him pretty much. Not just control him, but they could control new policies and they could use him to make problems for them disappear. Cotrone would send his men Niccolo Delorio and D'Asti, and they would basically hand Laporte a bag filled with money in hopes that it would help his campaign. Here's your contribution. On May 3rd of 1970, police picked up a wiretap of D'Asti and Delorio having a discussion on this matter, and that they were pinning their hopes on Laporte winning. Cotrone kept funneling money to Laporte non-stop. Laporte wouldn't win, but rather his opponent did, a guy by the name of Robert Barassa. While there was still hope that somehow the Cotrones could control Barassa, once again, Delorio and D'Asti were picked up on wiretaps discussing how they could force Barassa to bend at the knees and put Laporte in as Attorney General anyway. Okay, so he didn't win the election, so let's go to Barassa, let's give him some money, let's lean on him, and maybe they'll do us a favor and put Laporte in and he'll become the Attorney General. That would be fantastic. However, Laporte wouldn't become the Attorney General, but what Barassa does is puts him in as the Minister of Labor. So it wasn't a huge loss. The Cotrones still got something that they wanted. They have a guy they can control in a position to control somebody else, and that's all this is about. So two of Barassa's henchmen, a guy by the name of René Gagnon and Jean-Jacques Coté. Sorry about that. I get that from my father. Whenever he was doing a French accent, he'd always go, oh, ho, ho, ho. I don't know why. I get it from him. Anyway, so Jean-Jacques Coté, oh, ho, ho, would continue to meet secretly with the Cotrones. Coté would send word that the newly appointed Attorney General would be Jerome Choquette, and that Choquette was a friend of a friend, and he would be a friend of the Cotrone crime family. And all that simply meant for Cotrone at the time was, hey, they might not have gotten exactly what we wanted, but hey, we got a guy that we can play with now. We still have a way we can control things by proxy. So in August of 1970, Vic Cotrone heads to Acapulco, Mexico. I don't know why I said it like that. And we know this to be the Mexican Crime Summit. Now, we've said it before, and we've covered this topic with Johnny Papaglia. But a lot of people didn't believe that this meeting ever happened, but actually it did, because the FBI and Mexican authorities got tipped off before this meeting. So it 100% went down, and I'm going to prove it went down here shortly. But the impetus for that meeting was that the Cotrones knew that the legalization of casinos would be something that was coming up on the legislation in Montreal. And with their hands in the political pockets of pretty much everybody at that point, the discussion surrounded of how they could take control of these casinos and how to skim money and launder money the right way. And of course, Meyer Lansky is the head of this meeting because he's the X's and O's guy. He's going to teach everybody how to skim, how to do it, and how to get away with it. And he also represented the American Mafia's interests in casinos in Montreal. And let's just face it, the guy was an expert on the finances of organized crime. I'm not going to go back through the whole entire meeting because we discussed this with our Papaglia Crime Family series. So if you want sort of a refresher on that, go back to the Papaglias and listen to all of that. And we talked about that meeting in depth. So in October of 1970, things just kind of begin to unravel a little bit. Members of the FLQ, the Front de Liberation of Quebec, kidnapped Pierre Laporte. They also kidnapped British diplomat James Cross. The FLQ, the Front Liberation of Quebec, believed, and they're basically a fringe terrorist group, okay? Let's just get that out of the way. But they believed that elections had been rigged, and they knew about the close relationships between the Cotrone crime family and Laporte and other people. The FLQ had a manifesto that they wanted to read on the radio. And this is why they kidnapped Cross. And what they're trying to do is force the Canadian government to bend them at their knees and allow them to read their manifesto. And that's the whole reason why they kidnapped Cross. Now, if the government refused to allow them to do that, the FLQ promised that they would execute Cross. And they weren't fucking around. These guys were no jokes. So in this manifesto, they pointed out corruption and widespread abuse of French Canadian citizens, explaining that elections were rigged, and the only people who benefited from these rigged elections was the Simard family and the Cotrone family. The Simard family was a huge ship manufacturing company, huge, very wealthy, very corrupt. They further explained that violence would be necessary to achieve Quebec independence, which is a little crazy to say, but okay. They further lamented that the election won by the Liberal Party was a sham because it was fully controlled by the relationship between the Cotrone crime family and the Simard shipbuilding family. Like I said, the Simards were wealthy French-Canadian shipbuilders who were in cahoots with the Cotrone crime family. Those are just facts. The premier at the time, Robert Bourassa, was actually married to Amy Simard, who was the daughter of the Simard family. So not only now do you have the Simards who are in cahoots with the Cotrone crime family, but the president, Bourassa, is also married into the Simard family, which the FLQ essentially said is proof of corruption. So in this manifesto, they name Vic Cotroni over and over and over and over again. The FLQ, at its best, like I said earlier, was a terrorist organization who from 1963 until 1970 used over 200 homemade explosives to blow shit up. They simply were just a terrorist group, but things would get absolutely worse. And so here are the chain of events. And this is kind of important and the reason why I want to go through them, because if you're a mob boss, this is shit you don't want to be involved in. But this will show you the power of Cotrone and just the power of what was going on in Canada at the time. October 5th, Montreal, Quebec, 2 members of the Liberation Cell of the FLQ kidnapped British diplomat James Cross from his house. The kidnappers are disguised as delivery men bringing a package for his recent birthday. Once the maid lets them in, they pull out a rifle and a revolver and they kidnap Cross at gunpoint. This is followed by a communique to the authorities containing the kidnappers' demands, which included the exchange of Cross for political prisoners, a number of convicted or detained FLQ members, and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation broadcast of the FLQ manifesto. The terms of the ransom note are the same of those found in June for the planned kidnapping of the U.S. consulate. At this time, the police do not connect the two together. October 10th, one fucking day later, Montreal, Quebec, members of the Chenier Cell approach the home of Quebec Minister of Labor Pierre Laporte while he's playing football with his son on the front, or with his nephew on the front lawn. Members of the Chenier Cell of the FLQ kidnap Laporte at gunpoint. October 11th, the CBC broadcasts a letter from captivity from Pierre Laporte to the Premier of Quebec, Robert Bourassa. October 12th, General Gilles Turcotte sends troops from the Royal 22nd Regiment to the federal to guard the federal property in Montreal region by request of the federal government. Lawyer Robert Lemieux is appointed by the FLQ to negotiate the release of James Cross and Pierre Laporte. The Quebec government appoints Robert Demers as the negotiator. October 13th, Prime Minister Trudeau is introduced by the CBC with respect to the military presence. In a combative, talkative interview, Trudeau asked the reporter, Tim Ralph, what he would do in his place. If the position were yours, what would you do? When Ralph asked Trudeau how far he's going to go, Trudeau says, just watch me. October 14th, 16 prominent Quebec personalities, including René Levesque and Claude Ryan, call for negotiating exchange of the 2 hostages for the political prisoners. FLQ's lawyer, Robert Lemieux, urges the University of Montreal students to boycott classes in support of the FLQ. October 15th, Quebec City. The negotiations between the lawyers Lemieux and Demers are put to an end. The government of Quebec formally requests the intervention of the Canadian Army in aid of civil power pursuant to the National Defence Act. All 3 opposition parties, including the party Quebec, rise in the National Assembly and agree with the decision. On the same day, the separatist groups are permitted to speak at the University of Montreal. Robert Lemieux organizes 3,000 students in a rally in Paul Sauve Arena to show support for the FLQ. Labor leader Michael Chartrand announces that popular support for the FLQ is rising, and states were going to win because there are more boys ready to shoot members of parliament than there are policemen. That's some serious shit. The rally frightens many French-Canadian citizens who view it as a possible prelude to an outright insurrection in Quebec. October 16th, Premier Bourassa formally requests that the Government of Canada grant the Government of Quebec emergency powers that allow them to apprehend and keep custody of individuals. This results in the implementation of the War Measures Act allowing the suspension of habeas corpus, giving wide-reaching powers of arrest to police. The city of Montreal had already made such a request the day before. These measures came into effect at 4 o'clock in the morning. Prime Minister Trudeau makes a broadcast announcing the imposition of the War Measures Act. October 17th, Montreal, Quebec. The Chenier cell of the FLQ announces that hostage Pierre Laporte has been executed. He was strangled and then stuffed into the trunk of a car and abandoned in the bushes near St. Hubert Airport, a few miles from the Montreal. A communique to police advised that Pierre Laporte has been executed and refers to him derisively as the Minister of Unemployment and Assimilation. I don't know why that's funny, it just is. In another communique issued by the Liberation Cell holding James Cross, his kidnappers declared that they are suspending indefinitely the death sentence against him, that they will not release him, however, until their demands are met, and that he will be executed if the fascist police discover them and attempt to intervene at all. The demands that they make are the publication of the FLQ manifesto, the release of 23 political prisoners, an airplane to take them to either Cuba or Algeria, both countries that they feel have a strong connection because of their struggle against colonialism and imperialism, the rehiring of the Gardes de la Palme, a voluntary tax of $500,000 to be loaded aboard the plane prior to departure. The name of the informant who had sold out the FLQ activists early in the year. Tell us the name of the rat. We're going to go kill him too. This is hilarious. Controversially, police reports that were not released to the public until 2010 state that Pierre Laporte was actually accidentally killed during a struggle. The FLQ subsequently wanted to use his death to its advantage by convincing the government that they should be taken seriously. However, this cannot be verified. October 18th, while denouncing the acts of subversion and terrorism, both of which are so tragically contrary to the best interests of our people, columnist, politician, and future premier of Quebec, René Levesque, criticizes the War Measures Act. Until we receive proof of the size of the Revolutionary Army, to the contrary, we will believe that such a minute, numerically unimportant fraction is involved, and that rushing into the enactment of War Measures Act was panicky and altogether an excessive reaction, especially when you think of the inordinate length of time that they want to maintain this filthy regime. November 6th, police raid the hiding place of the FLQ's Chenier cell. Although 3 members escaped the raid, Bernard Lordy is arrested and charged with kidnapping and the murder of Pierre Laporte. December 3rd, Montreal, Quebec, after being held hostage for 62 days. British Trade Commissioner James Cross is released by the FLQ Liberation Cell after negotiations between lawyers Bernard Mergler and Robert Demers. Simultaneously, the 5 known kidnappers, Marc Charbonneau, Yves Langlois, Jacques Lancelot, Jacques Cossette Trudel, and his wife Louise Lancelot, are granted safe passage to Cuba by the government of Canada after approval by Fidel Castro. They are flown to Cuba by Canadian Forces aircraft. Jacques Lancelot, the same man who earlier in the year had been arrested and then released on bail for the attempted kidnapping of the Israeli consul. And keep in mind, I'm telling you all of this because they keep mentioning Vic Cotroni throughout their little sermon. December 23rd, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau announces that all troops stationed in Quebec will be withdrawn by January 15th of 71. December 28th, St. Luc, Quebec. 3 members of the Chenier cell are still at large. Paul Rose, Jacques Rose, and Francis Simard are arrested. So there's a Simard that's involved in the FLQ. Imagine that. They're arrested after being found in a 6-meter tunnel in a rural farming community. They would later be charged with the kidnapping and murder of Pierre Laporte. So, going through all of that mess, this was not good for Vic Cotroni, because for the first time, Cotroni's name and face were all over television because these people were talking about him. Because of the hellish month, Bourassa, who at one time was the guy that was secretly and publicly pushing for the legalization of the casinos in Montreal, likely out of fear, he does a very public and private U-turn on his policies and friendships. And this made Cotroni look bad in the eyes of just not the media, but in the mafia in general. And I can only imagine what Paolo Violi and his underlings thought about all of this. So, In 1972, Maclean's magazine published an article on Vic Cotroni labeling him the godfather of Montreal. Cotroni is absolutely fucking enraged by this, and he files a lawsuit against the company. But it was another example of he had basically been outed publicly, and all the press and media coverage over the years was starting to weigh heavily on him. He would file a lawsuit for $1.25 million, and his attorney would claim that his client had not been convicted of any crime since 1938, and that the magazine simply had invented a story. The lawyer for the Macleans didn't hold back when it went to depositions and trial, bringing up the fact that Cotroni had been seen and had business dealings with Joe Bonanno. And I can see it now. Cotroni thinking to himself, that motherfucker, I cannot rid myself of that prick for any fucking reason. Everywhere he turns, the Joe Bonanno ghost keeps coming back to him. Maclean hired Ralph Salerno, and you guys may know who that is, who was a former NYPD intelligence unit guy. They flew him over, and he testified as an expert witness. He confirmed that Vic Cotroni was a mob boss and had deep ties to Joe Bonanno. He stated on the stand that while Bonanno was now a pariah, Cotroni's power had only grown. Under cross-examination, Cotroni was asked about frequent phone calls he had with Joe Bonanno, and he explained, yeah, we talked, but I can't remember what we talked about. The Maclean's lawyer then begins to pound Cotroni, accusing him of extortion and extorting Montreal Ace Trucking Company, which Cotroni explained he had never heard of in his life. Problem was, the attorney had evidence, and he had receipts that Ace Trucking had paid Cotroni $16,000 in 1960, $15,300 in 1961, and almost $16,000 in 1962, and the payment was marked as sales representative. Cotroni, enraged and probably very embarrassed, explained, oh, I just forgot about that. Then the lawyer from Maclean's then brings up a bribery charge in which Cotroni attempted to bribe a Montreal cop with $50,000. And basically what happened was Cotroni was partying at his Gumana's house, and he was hanging out with Joe Asaro. And Joe Asaro was wanted all over the place in New York. The cop came to the door for whatever reason, and when he knocks on the door, he sees Asaro. And he sees Cotroni, and Cotroni's got a problem. Not only does he not want to be seen with Asaro, but he doesn't want his wife to know that he's basically cheating on her, all right? And so instead, what he does is he offered $50,000 for the cop to look the other way, but the cop didn't. And then the Maclean lawyer drops another bomb. He asks Vic Cotroni about Meyer Lansky and the meeting in Mexico. Cotroni denied ever hear. He said, I've never heard that name Meyer Lansky in my life. I've never met a man like that. I've never been to Mexico. And the lawyer produces a photo of the two together talking in Acapulco with a bunch of other gangsters. And the damage is done. While it didn't certifiably prove that Cotroni was a mobster, what it was able to prove is that he had relationships that were less than honest. And he ends up losing the lawsuit. And here's my thing, right? So Cotroni doesn't have to file a lawsuit. If he never filed, first of all, the FLQ is mentioning him. Now he's in newspaper articles. If he just never pushes that issue and says, let them say whatever the fuck they want about me, they can't prove it. If he had just done that, then he doesn't get embarrassed. And the problem is that when all of these things start coming out and he's caught lying, it's bad for business. And so for Cotroni, in many aspects, his anger begins to lead to his demise. And when I say demise, I mean, he allowed the nonsense of a magazine to propel him into the spotlight, and it earmarked him for public assertions and public ridicule. And he has spent so much of his life laying low, doing the right thing. But he allows his anger to blow his cover. And I don't know exactly what American bosses thought of that, but I think from our side of the fence, we can understand how they would have felt. Sit down, shut the fuck up, stop making headlines, please. And you could also imagine what the effect that would have on somebody like Paolo Violi, who is already chomping at the bit to take over. And that's what made Cotroni look soft. You're such a quiet guy. You get a little pissed off because of a headline. Now you're making a fucking fool out of yourself. So since the pressure of the FLQ business and now the magazine bullshit, Cotroni begins to consider stepping down. Business was good, but the heat and the public media scrutiny was going to end up putting him in prison if he's not careful. And he makes a decision. He makes a decision to change the hierarchy of his own family, which was the worst decision he could have ever fucking made. Because while he had his brother Frank running a lot of things, he makes the decision not to put Frank in charge for the time being. What he decides to do is put the one guy in charge that wants to take over everything, and that's Paolo Violi. And he puts him in control of the day-to-day operations of the crime family. He gives it to him, puts it in his hands. And Cotrone would be basically the boss, but was acting more so in an advisory capacity to Paolo Violi. And as Violi takes over, this is where things are. Now you're going to understand why I stopped pretty much here. As Violi takes over, a problem begins to root itself. Niccolo Rizzuto, who was a captain within the Sicilian faction of the Cotrone crime family, begins to do whatever the fuck he wants. He stops reporting. He stops explaining his business dealings. He's basically like, fuck it, I'm doing whatever I want. Let him try to stop me. He stops reporting, stops conducting, stops going to meetings, and he's spreading his wings like an eagle and beginning to move into turf that doesn't belong to him. In 1972, Luigi Greco, who was the head of the Sicilian faction of the Cotrone crime family, actually dies. And this is a big, big, big problem. Because not only was Greco, even though he was the head of the Sicilian wing, he was an honorable guy. He was a respectful guy. And the problem is, he dies. Who's the second in command of that crew? Rizzuto. And Rizzuto has ambitions himself, much like Violi does. And what ends up happening is Luigi Greco was actually at his restaurant, a pizzeria, and he was retiling the floor. And somehow the solvent that he was using to seal the floor caught fire. He was burned alive. Burned alive. That's a fucking horrible way to go. And that's going to earmark change within the Sicilian faction, as Niccolo Rizzuto is now going to be the leader of the Sicilians. And when you have two guys from two different regions in Italy, remember what I said at the very beginning. Cotrone was very smart in putting Sicilians with Sicilians, Northern Italians together, Calabrians together, just keeping everything sort of situated the way it needed to be. But Violi didn't have those beliefs because Violi's not Sicilian. He's Calabrian. And he doesn't give a fuck about Sicilians, doesn't even like Sicilians. So everything that Vic Cotrone fought to have is now about to go to a very interesting place. Because not only does Violi want to take over, but Rizzuto on the other side of it is controlling the Sicilian wing of the family now. And he wants to take over. And he doesn't like Violi. So much so, he's just disrespecting him left and right. And the reason why we're stopping here is because you're about to know where this is going to go. And like I said, I know I said we would be done this week, but obviously we're going to, I really want to do two things next week. I want to talk a little bit more about Luigi Greco and everything up until this point to just kind of show you how that wing of the family worked. And it's important to show you that because Rizzuto comes in and fucks it all up. But not so much fucks it all up, but he decides, nope, I'm going to do whatever I want. I'm taking over. And meanwhile, Violi's been chomping at the bit for 2 years now to take fucking over. He thinks Cotrone's soft. And the minute that he starts to think that Rizzuto's trying to make an effort to try to do something, oh no, that's not going to happen. Worse coming to Montreal. And even because while Cotrone had a belief in putting ethnic lines together, the one thing he never hoped that would happen is going to happen because Rizzuto wants control of the family as well as Violi. What is going to begin is a bloodbath that lasts almost a decade. So when we come back next week, Violi wants control. Rizzuto begins to flex. And Rizzuto even begins doing whatever he wants without zero care about what Violi thinks. Violi knows that Rizzuto's posturing, and he knows what is getting ready to come down the pike. And so he goes and sits down with Vic Cotrone, and he asks Vic Cotrone to make contact with the Bonanno crime family to send soldiers, because shit's about to get crazy. The American Mafia doesn't want a war. But war was coming whether they wanted it or not. And so next week will be the finale of the Cotrone crime family. And like I said, history always repeats itself. In every particular case we talk about, it's always the same. All right, so we're going to get out of here. I appreciate you all for hanging in with me, and I hope you're not too pissed about the Q&A. There's only so much I can do. You know what I mean? Last night, I went out with some friends to a cigar place in Soho, and I met one of my idols, Ty Domi, former NHLer. It was a really cool experience, I posted the photo over on Instagram. I typically do not photo well, and that photo of me looks like I look like a fucking bingo grandmother. But I had a lot of fun. Anyway, we are going to get into the Cotrone crime family, like I said. We have one more episode after this, which will be next week. So when we left off last week, Vic Cotrone had several issues that were brewing. The first was that he attempted to sue the McLean magazine for laying assertions that he was in the Mafia and he was a Mafia boss. Not only did he lose that lawsuit, but the evidence that the McLean lawyers had used against him in court just proved what many had suspected throughout the years. Rather than let the words go, Vic didn't. And as a result, he took massive heat publicly. And when you combine that with what the FLQ did, any chance of the Cotrones using their power to sway government was essentially out the door. The press was bad, and Cotrone began to feel the heat. Understanding that it was finally time to sort of step back into the shadows, he ends up changing the hierarchy of the family. He demotes his brother Frank to a captain within the family and promotes Paolo Violi. So when Luigi Greco dies, as we talked last week, when there was a fire at his pizzeria, it naturally created a bit of a power vacuum on the side of the Sicilians. Greco, who believed in the old school ways, kept a firm grip on the Sicilian factions within inside that family. If Violi was hoping that Cotrone would completely vanish, he would be totally wrong. What Cotrone does is essentially hand over the day-to-day operations of the family to Paolo Violi and pretty much just advises him. So does that mean that Violi now controls the family? No. He simply is the guy that's handing down orders, but Cotrone gives him a little bit of room and leeway to make his own decisions as well. As Violi takes over, he ends up expanding into markets completely, taking all of them over. We've seen this before when we talk about historical figures. Some guys encroach totally out of their territory, and other guys just bulk up what they already have. Violi was one of those guys who wanted everything. And we typically know how that usually ends, to be perfectly honest with you. Anything from shakedowns to ice cream parlors, Violi shook down and took. Everybody was paying protection, and if they didn't, he would bend them at the knees. Violi by nature was a brute. However, he commanded respect and honor from his men. Once 3 of his men were outside cursing in front of a child, and he pulled all 3 of those guys into a store, held out a knife, and threatened to cut the tongue out of any man who ever dared to swear in front of a child again. He loathed men who were not honorable to their wives. He issued threats that anybody caught cheating, he considered an abomination. And that created problems, and he demanded that his men never cheat. And if they got caught, there would be consequences for them. Violi had an old school thought process, but was essentially driven by money and power, really nothing else. Violence was his immediate go-to move. While he could be conciliatory to some extent if he wanted to be, his typical modus operandi would have been violence. That would have been the tool of the trade that he would use. So late in 1972, Paolo Violi begins to have issues with Niccolo Rizzuto. Rizzuto was born in Sicily in 1924, and by every account, that's been published in newspaper articles and etc., his father was a made guy in Sicily, and his father, Vito, of course, and he immigrated to New York in 1925 with his brother-in-law. Niccolo and his mother were left behind back in Sicily. On August 12th of 1933, his father, Vito, would be murdered in Paterson, New York, in a Mafia hit. Not much is known about his childhood, but in 1945, he marries Libertina Mano, who was the daughter of a local Mafia boss in Sicily. So once again, we're seeing sort of, this is some old school stuff, and this is often what happened. They would marry into mob families. In 1954, he would immigrate to Canada with his wife and his child, Vito, and would land on Pier 21 in Halifax, Nova Scotia, before settling in Montreal. Niccolo had a lot of relatives who had already established roots in Montreal and New York, and eventually the Manos from Sicily would arrive as well. He began his life on the streets not long after arriving in Canada, as he had mob contacts back in Sicily, New York, and even in Argentina. So he came to this country much like Carlo Gambino did, to the extent that he already had family that was in the streets and running things. And so it was a simple just extension of, here I am now, this is what I'm going to do. So he had just come to a new country, but like I said, he had serious contacts, and none of them were as powerful as the Cotrone Caruana clan. We've talked about them before, but he would get his first bit of work with the Cotrone crime family, quickly becoming an associate and moving up the ranks. And that's where I want to stop with sort of his background, because we're going to cover that whole entire crime family, so I'd rather do that at another point. So like we said just a minute ago, in 1972, Violi begins to have issues with Nick Rizzuto. The problem, it would seem, with Luigi Greco having passed away, there was little oversight within the Sicilian ranks without Luigi Greco. The fact that Rizzuto stopped reporting to Violi, stopped informing him about what he was doing, the fact that he was consistently going back and forth to New York and other places in other countries, it begins to rub Violi wrong, and rightfully so. Violi felt that Rizzuto was making moves on his own, not consulting with the family that he belonged to, and it doesn't take rocket science to see why Violi would begin to feel threatened by that. So Rizzuto essentially is making a power move. He wanted separation between the Sicilians and the Calabrians. Violi, who wasn't exactly a Sicilian supporter by any stretch of the imagination, agreed with what Cotrone felt, meaning that, you know, the Sicilians handle the Sicilians, the Calabrians are together, and let's just keep it that way. It's good for business. Rizzuto, on the other hand, thumbed his nose and called them Calabrian pigs. So he did not like Calabrians at all, and Rizzuto felt that he was above them, better than them, and that no Sicilian should ever take orders from any Calabrian under any fucking circumstance. So you could see where this is kind of going to go. Violi would send out feelers trying to find out just what Rizzuto was up to, but he really couldn't get enough intel. Rizzuto had insulated himself insanely well. So when you have a guy that's running around dealing with New York, dealing with people in other countries, you start to say, wait a second, we're one family here. This guy is just doing whatever he wants. And that's going to create problems. Even if Rizzuto had been with the Cotrone since the early 1950s, he always gravitated towards the Sicilians, and he believed, because the Bonannos were Sicilians, that he would rather deal directly with them and not anybody else. What Violi and Cotrone didn't know at the time was that the Cotrone Caruana clan were already in Montreal operating with Rizzuto, and they were moving a ton of narcotics. Look at the Cotrone Caruana as the Rothschilds of the Canadian Mafia. They had serious money, and with money comes hidden power. And I cannot imagine for any second that Cotrone didn't know that the Cotrone Caruana clan was there. I'm sure they knew. And I can't imagine that Violi didn't know that. But I think that they underestimated the scale of what Rizzuto was doing with them, because by the time Rizzuto arrives, there's already a dozen Cotrone Caruana clan members operating in Montreal, and so he aligns with them. So you can see where Rizzuto is basically stacking the deck at this point. Cotrone, for his part, did the right thing, and he reaches out to the Bonannos, and he requests permission to kill Nick Rizzuto. And that request gets denied. And the reason why they wanted him killed is because they felt like it was going to be a power grab, a power struggle. He wasn't reporting to the family. And by nature, a boss can avail of himself from the commission in New York to kill a prick. That's just the reality. And this is one of the reasons why Violi hated the commission. Why are we abiding by them? We're in our own country doing our own thing. Just because we are related to the Bonannos by sort of, what's the term? Sponsorship. Why do we have to fucking do what the commission says? And so so from that aspect, I can understand why Paolo Violi felt that way. but they went to the commission and asked. The commission said no. And so we have to ask ourselves, why would the Bonanno crime family say no, and why would the commission say no? And at the time, the request would have been made to Joe Diamond Evola. Evola would have denied the request, likely because he knew war, was going to, if they had killed Rizzuto, there would have been war, and they were really trying to avoid more problem. And war wasn't really a palatable option, especially with everything that's happened there the last decade or so. This was simply an internal problem. But with Rizzuto making waves, I can see where the Bonannos were thinking, this is about money, this is about power, and that's why we don't want to do this, because it's an internal beef. It should be handled like gentlemen. That's the way the commission felt. But the commission also saw this as sort of a guy making a run for a power grab. Now, under more normal circumstances, they would kill the guy. But the fact that he's making a ton of money, he's moving territory, he seems to be the type of guy that, at least on some level, will communicate what he's doing with New York. Well, what the fuck do they care? So really the commission's point of view is, why make it worse? The guy's making us a lot of money. Like, let's not kill the golden goose. And I think that that's realistically sort of the demeanor that they had at the time. Rizzuto was growing powerful, and perhaps with everything that Cotrone had been doing to create public problems on top of that, was probably just enough for Joe Diamond to say, you know what, we're not going to allow you to do this, because you're going to the commission, you're asking to take the head off a guy, but yet you can't stay out of the fucking papers. So it's like, maybe they started viewing Rizzuto as the heir apparent. I can't speak for them, but it would make sense sort of in a logistical, just the optics on it. You can kind of understand. So what was Rizzuto up to? Well, there's a lot of things. There was another issue which sort of elevates the situation even more, is that Tommaso Buscetta arrives in Montreal and has meetings with Rizzuto. Buscetta was there to discuss issues of the Sicilian Mafia in Montreal. Buscetta explained that the Rizzutos were not full-fledged members in Italy with the Contreras clan, but rather simply they were members of the Bonanno crime family. Buscetta explained that the time was ripe for Rizzuto to step up and challenge the Calabrians for power. Also at this meeting, Buscetta further discusses narcotics operations and rackets and routes with Rizzuto and Pasquale Contreras. So here you go. You got Buscetta coming in, and now they're organizing narcotics routes. They're organizing narcotics in general, which money creates power. Power creates everything. And so Rizzuto is making a ballsy move, and Buscetta's almost baiting him. Why are you going to let the Calabrians tell you what to do? Fuck them. We got this. So more or less, the Contreras were taking over all the narcotics from Canada to New York. The operation was easy. Narcotics arrived by ships and would be driven to Buffalo, New York by car or by truck for distribution. They also discussed the purchase, and this is the huge news that you guys, I told you before, we had some big news that I don't think anybody's ever heard before, and you're about to hear it now. At this meeting, they also discussed the purchase of a huge cattle ranch that had its own airstrip built, located in Venezuela, which would serve as a haven for big mob guys and narcotics meetings. And the investors, the ones who put the money on the property, were Salvatore Greco, Antonio Napoli, Pasquale Contreras, and Carlo Gambino. Let me say that again. Carlo Gambino. When I came across this information, I went, holy shit. And the reason why I say that is because I never knew that. Because Carlo was such an unassuming kind of guy that I don't know how many people believe or thought how much of the politics he was involved in. And it turns out he was involved in a ton of different political moves. And we always knew that he was Machiavellian, that he was a sort of a strategist. But I never knew how deep he was into narcotics. Yes, they had things and inroads in Sicily. I understand that. He was a part of a lot of the conferences and stuff like that. But he gave the money to buy this cattle ranch, which was going to be used as a stopping point for narcotics. It was also going to be a point of contact for mobsters in Venezuela, Argentina, but we're getting somewhere else, Colombia. Because as it turns out, guess who was providing Colombians with narcotics? Carlo Gambino. They used this cattle ranch was 90 miles from Colombia. And they would use that as a staging point and a shipping point. And they were providing Colombians with opiates and all kinds of other things. And this is something I didn't even know. And I never didn't assume that Gambino wasn't involved in narcotics. I just didn't know how deep involved he was in narcotics. So they would end up forming a corporation called the Ganaderia Rio Zappa, which was more or less a front. It was a front cattle company for narcotics distribution. They would also purchase up all of the land around the area. So everything within like a 90-mile radius they bought until they get to the line of Colombia. Obviously, Colombia is a different country. But Gambino, and we're talking $80 million operation for buying all of this land, and that's today's value. That's what I think it was something like $29 million in those days to buy all of this land which Gambino still owns to this day in Venezuela. That's crazy, but it estimated something about the inflation. It was like something like close to $80 million or something crazy like that. But basically, they bought up all of the land that took them to the line of Colombia. So if they own all the land in Venezuela, they can go right from what they own in Venezuela to Colombia. Colombians can come right over the line and have a safe place. Colombians could fly in if they wanted to. People from other countries could fly in under the radar. These are the days they don't have what they have today as far as Coast Guard and planes flying around with radar and all of that. They didn't have any of that back then. So basically at this place, they would map out the drug routes and they would end up hiding narcotics in powdered milk boxes. And it was actually an old trick that Joe Bonanno had used for years. And they would dump metric tons of shit, I would say manure, but shit, to throw off sniffer dog scents. So all around this area that they bought, they would dump piles of shit because they worried that if local police decided to investigate, it would throw off the dogs so they couldn't smell, I guess, pot and whatever else, and coke and whatever. It was a pretty brilliant move. And they simply just mapped out narcotics from Colombia to Venezuela, to Caracas, to Canada, to New York. And so what's really interesting about all of this is we know the old drug routes because we've talked about them time and time again on this show. But it's very interesting to find that Carlo Gambino was the financier of all of this. And to my knowledge, I don't believe he ever was in Venezuela. He might have been. One never knows. But the fact that he put all the money into this tells you a lot about him. So after that meeting, Rizzuto heads to Rome and he meets with Meyer Lansky. And the reason why Rizzuto meets with him is because he wants to fully understand how to launder money. And Lansky gives him great advice. He says, always invest in legitimate companies. Take your money and wash it in legitimate enterprises and have as many as you can. And that was great advice because these are things that Johnny Papaglia did. These are things that Cotrone did attempt to do, but Cotrone could not stay out of the fucking headlines. So eventually, as usual, all secrets find a way to come out, right? You can't ever totally hide everything. And Cotrone and Paolo Violi find out, and they summon Rizzuto to a meeting. And at this meeting, Cotrone demanded to know what the fuck Rizzuto was doing in Venezuela and with who. And Rizzuto smirked and refused to answer the question. Because it shows that basically Gambino is backing Rizzuto. The whole commission is backing Rizzuto, but really at the end of the day, the only guy that matters is Gambino because he's head of the commission. And if Gambino is in business with Rizzuto and the cattle ranch and everything else that's going on, Cotrone didn't stand a chance. Cotrone didn't stand a chance. And we know that the Rizzutos end up becoming the most powerful family in Canada in the history of organized crime. Not anymore, but for a good 20-year span, You couldn't do anything. They had thousands of members. Some asshole on the internet said I said 1 million. I never said that. I never said that. I said there was 1 million members of Ndrangheta. Absolutely. But I never said that the Rizzutos were worldwide. A lot of people don't understand that. They weren't just based in Canada, Venezuela, Spain, Germany, France, fucking everywhere. Everywhere. Anyway. So like I said, Cotrone eventually finds out. They have Rizzuto come and sit down. Rizzuto basically refuses to say a word, and that meeting ends with Cotrone absolutely fucking irate and Violi foaming at the mouth. From the outside looking in, Rizzuto was breaking Mafia rules, but Rizzuto also knew who was backing him. And if he had said Gambino, can you imagine the shitstorm that would have ended it right there? But Rizzuto was really good. He was already insulating himself. But like we said before, when you just kind of drop off the radar, it creates a lot of issues internally. And if guys already have suspicions about you or don't like you, it's just going to be amplified by that. But now they're definitely going to be suspicious because you're refusing to say a fucking word. And to make matters more contentious, word gets back to Violi and Cotrone, and they find out that Rizzuto had met with Nicolina Alfano, who was a New York-made guy and the head of the Sicilian clan of the Bonannos. And word is that Rizzuto was basically shit-talking them, saying awful things about Cotrone and Violi. Violi is furious, and he ends up calling for a meeting, and he calls for one to take place at Epiphany, which was located northeast of Montreal. 23 people were in attendance. Members of the Rizzutos were in attendance. Members of the Caruana clan were in attendance, and the meeting was to be about Niccolo Rizzuto and what to do. Vic Cotroni, who hears about the meeting, worries that the meeting's going to be too open, too public, too pre-planned. He had already had a bunch of headlines, so at the last minute, he's like, fuck this shit, I'm not going to go. And it was a smart move that he didn't, because Violi had such a big fucking mouth that they caught Violi on bugs talking about the meeting and the reason for it. The meeting didn't result in any sort of conclusion either, as most felt that Rizzuto was in the right. Violi argued that men who don't follow orders, men who do what they want, are doing things, and that's against the rules. But meanwhile, the pink elephant in the room, which nobody's telling fucking Violi about, is, well, Carlo Gambino backs Niccolo Rizzuto, so what do you want us to do? But none of them give up that information. Joe Diamond, who had denied the request of Violi and Cotrone, wanted to see for himself what was going on. So he sends Nicolino Alfano and Niccolo Buttafuoco and Mike Zafrano to Montreal. And he does this because they're just checking off their boxes. Let's do an internal investigation. Let's see really what's going on here. And all it was to placate them. All it was to placate Cotrone. And so after they do their alleged little internal investigation, it was decided that Rizzuto was untouchable and that he should be a part of the Cotrone crime family, whether Cotrone liked it or not. News would travel back to Cotrone and Violi of Joe Diamond's decision, which really, at the end of the day, guess whose decision it actually was? And I think you know the answer to that. So Violi, who is absolutely fucking irate, vents his anger at the commission, which he always felt they should not be beholden to them to begin with, but the commission had spoken. And they explained to Rizzuto that, you know what, you should touch base once in a while, and you shouldn't hide everything that you're doing, i.e., don't mention Carlo Gambino. The problem with Violi screaming at people is it put him in a very dangerous position. He's not accepting what we've told him to do. Now we've got a problem. And Rizzuto at the same time knows it's not exactly safe for him either, because he knows Violi's probably going to want to kill him. And so what Rizzuto does is every couple of weeks, he does what old Sicilians do. He starts moving around. We've seen, Denaro, did this stuff. Totorina did this stuff. They move around. He would go back and forth to New York, back and forth to Venezuela. And while the shooting had not begun as of yet, it was getting more and more contentious. And with Rizzuto knowing that he had the backing of Gambino and the commission, pretty much did whatever he wanted to, but he at least stayed out of eyesight of people. So in 1973, Violi and Cotrone put a contract on the Rizzuto's head, regardless of the commission's no murder policy. Rizzuto would leave for Venezuela to keep himself safe. So despite the fact the commission said you cannot kill him, they ordered it anyway. Two of Vic Cotroni's 4 lieutenants were out of the picture. Greco was dead. While Vic's brother Frank had been busted for drug trafficking, he would soon receive a lengthy sentence in the United States. One of the third guys he had, Niccolo Delorio, who we've talked about before, wasn't interested in becoming boss because he knew what was coming. And that left the power-hungry Paolo Violi. In the fall of 1973, events convinced him that he was destined to ascend the Mafia hierarchy. Joe Diamond Evola dies of cancer, and then there would be an election scheduled to choose the new head of the Bonanno crime family. The captains of the clan were summoned to a Hotel Americana in New York. The Montreal Mafia had a vote, which is odd to me. I'm surprised they would even allow that. But like I said earlier, I think this is all like window trimmings. But since Vic Cotroni was barred from entering the United States, Violi has to go and represent Montreal along with Joe DiMaolo. To Violi's sheer surprise, the main candidate, Rusty Rastelli, wanted his vote. This is some treacherous shit. So Rastelli basically goes to him and says, I could use your vote. I'll patch things up between people. This will be a better situation, but vote for me. And Rastelli actually knew Montreal well because while he was on the lam, he had taken refuge there in the 1960s, and he benefited from the Cotrone organization's hospitality. So Violi ends up backing Rastelli, who becomes the official head of the Bonanno crime family in 1974. One good turn deserves another, Violi would say, and he would waste little time in reminding Rastelli, I voted you in, so I may need some things from you. And you know what Violi wants. He wants to kill Niccolo Rizzuto. That's exactly what this is about. So 2 months later, on April 22nd, the police microphones that the RCMP had installed captured a very interesting conversation in an ice cream parlor on Jean Talon Street in Montreal. And what it was Violi talking with Pietro Sciarra and Giuseppe Cufaro. And basically, this is what they were talking about. They asked whether or not he could be inducted in the Montreal outfit, and Violi said, no, because you see, Pino, things here, I know all about it. It's in America. Someone who comes here from Italy, it's orders, and you better believe it. He has to stay here for 5 years under us. So in other words, you're coming from another country, you can't be made unless you're with us for 5 years. This was Violi's edict. And it's a smart one. I totally agree. And then he says, after the 5 years are up, then everyone can see what you're like. So Pino is basically saying, listen, I want to get made. How do I get made in this Canadian family? And he's like, you can't. This is America controls what we do. You have to be with us at least 5 years. Those are the rules. Okay. So before we let anybody near us, he has to deserve to stay. We'll know whether or not he's good or not, meaning we got to figure out if we can trust this prick. That's all it means. On May 10th, Cufaro, an Italian gangster named Carmelo Salemi, pressed the issue. Salemi, who lived in Agrigento, was visiting Montreal. He wanted Giovanni Caruana, the former boss in Agrigento province who had emigrated to Venezuela, to have the status of a made guy when he was in Montreal. And Violi gave up all pretense of diplomacy and took an abrupt tone to show the other men who the fucking boss of this family was. You come here, but you can't talk about the affairs of the family. So in other words, you're not a made guy. You can't even discuss family business with me. Do you understand? Once again, smart guy. And the business that has gone on for several years, the business of your family, Cufaro asked. So in other words, Cufaro is saying, wait a minute, you've told me stuff before, like, why is this different? And basically, Violi says the Italians come here, they change their residence, they come here to us, they have to wait 5 years with us, and after that, they can join. If there is an opening and we want to give it to them, we give it to them. That's the way it is, that's the way it will be, that's the way it's going to be done. Do you understand? So he's snubbing him. And it was sort of insulting to a large extent because Cufaro had done a lot of work for them. So it's just an insulting sort of thing, but it's Violi flexing. It's just Violi flexing. Violi wants his men to prove their worth and Violi's basically telling them, listen, you want to be in this thing, but you gotta, it's like a lengthy trial period before you can even be considered And Salemi, who was a high-ranking member of the Agrigento Mafia, insisted that Violi recognized Cuffaro, but the self-styled boss of St. Leonard would not capitulate. So in other words, he didn't give a fuck. You aren't a part of us. If you belong over there, you belong over there. You just can't come over here. You can't talk about your family here. You can't talk about anything. Do you understand? And he added that his crew could not vouch for Sicilians who might find themselves having problems in Montreal. Let's say you take it into your head to do something on your own, something heavy. You don't say anything to anybody and something happens to you. Tell me, how do you get out of it then? Do you see how that happens, Carmel? Do you understand that? Salemi insists that Giovanni Caruana be admitted to the organization. You people in Italy have bad habits, Violi answers him. He was made in Sicily, but now he's in Venezuela. Suppose he wasn't going to go back to Sicily. Then he wants to come here. You people want your own law here, but it's different here. So in other words, them asking for him to do a favor, he's not cutting it. There's a difference between Sicily, like you're made over there, but you want the same respect coming over here, and that's just not going to happen. On May 13th, Violi meets with the Sicilians again, and he repeats that there was unity in Montreal among the representatives of American Cosa Nostra families. He himself answered to the Bonannos, but kept good relations with the Magadino family in Buffalo, who controlled Ontario. Newly arrived men from Sicily, however, as far as he was concerned, were persona non grata. And he said, we here have contacts with all the families in the United States. We're all friends. On May 17th, Cuffaro once again is begging. He asked Violi to set up a meeting with Vic Cotroni, who had the last word when it came to inducting new members in Montreal. And Cuffaro says, I'd like to meet Vic Cotroni. Violi says, yeah, one day you might. And Cuffaro says, well, I thank you, and I expect with time we'll be able to arrange that. And he says, consider me like one of you, Cuffaro starts to talk. To carry out your orders, that's my desire. Violi didn't bend, and the Sicilians were excluded. And it's not just necessarily the fact that trial by error here. It's the fact they're Sicilian, okay, and he's Calabrian, and he doesn't want anything to do with them. So that summer, the CECO called Vic Cotroni for contempt and ordered him jailed. He was evasive on the stand, giving answers that were clearly intended to be of no use to the court whatsoever. Violi hoped that he would be officially named to replace him as head of the Montreal Mafia, but Cotroni had given no clear instructions as to what he wanted to do. In January of 1975, Violi shared his frustration with two of his friends, Salvatore Sorrentino and Pietro Sciarra. And with every exchange that was taped, it took place in an ice cream shop that Violi owned. And every single fucking conversation was recorded. And Violi says when Vic was put in prison, he didn't see anyone about putting somebody in charge. He got out after 2 days. At Christmas time, he met with me. He didn't tell me, look, while I'm inside, you take charge and handle the family business. Since Vic's inside now, somebody's got to take the responsibility. He dispatched Sorrentino and Sciarra, the advisor he trusted most, to New York City to ask for instructions from Rusty Rastelli, the new boss of the Bonanno family. So in other words, Vic's in jail, hasn't given any instructions. They need to send word, so he sends Pietro Sciarra to New York to find out what Rusty Rastelli wants them to do. Somebody's got to be named head of the family. Otherwise, what are they going to do? And doing that actually helped because Rastelli basically said, okay, yeah, since he didn't name anybody, we're going to name Paolo Violi the acting street boss for the time. And of course, Violi hears this, and he ends up telling Joe DiMaolo on January 18th of 1975, and he gets caught on wiretap again. Rastelli told me, when Vic gets out, tell him to call me, and if a change needs to be made, I'll talk to Vic. But for now, you're taking over. Cotroni would soon be out of jail, and he wasn't in jail very long, but for the moment, Violi could boast that he was boss of the family. So it's showing the ego on Violi. So whatever joy that Violi thought he was going to get was very short-lived, because he ends up getting charged with rigging securities fraud on the Montreal Stock Exchange and also with attempted extortion. Worse is the CECO exposed the Expo 67 tainted meat scandal. Vic Cotroni, Paolo Violi, Salvatore Sorrentino, Armand Corville, the wrestler who we've talked about before, who had given Violi his start in Montreal criminal world, were co-owners of Reggio Foods, which was a meat wholesaler that sourced its wares from companies in the business of recovering livestock that had died of disease or natural causes. Though the meat was unfit even for dog food, the carcasses were cut up and processed into sausages and pepperoni. The public would end up learning that a significant amount of tainted meat had been used to make the hamburgers that were sold on the site of the 67 World's Fair. Then in 1973, Reggio Foods had won the contract to supply the Quebec Summer Games. More than 40 athletes would fall ill and several events were disrupted because of this tainted meat. Quebecers were already glued to their TV screens for the CECO hearings. And when the commissioners began disclosing when commissioners began to basically play excerpts from the wiretaps from the ice cream parlor, Paolo Violi's reputation as a model citizen who donated to charities and gave out free ice cream to neighborhood kids was reduced to less than zero. So now he's being seen as just a punk. Like Cotroni, Violi refused to violate his code of ethics and refused to answer a single question in front of the crime commission. In fact, believe it or not, he refused to testify at all, which earned him a jail sentence for contempt like Cotroni before him. He may have respected the vow of silence, but the Mafia would never forgive him for being so stupidly fucking careless as to let a cop bug his place of business. He's talking way too openly. Those recordings, which revealed the full scope of his criminal activities, would eventually prove extremely useful to law enforcement in Canada, the United States, and in Italy, not to mention be the nail in the coffin of Paolo Violi. Meanwhile, back in New York, Rusty Rastelli actually finds himself in a jam, and he ends up in prison, just as Carmine Galante gets paroled. And basically, as we know, Galante immediately wants to take over. Galante, as we know, he knew Montreal well. He lived there for a long time before he got thrown out. He was Sicilian born, and he was in favor of inducting Sicilians into the mob. And unlike Violi, who would impose a 5-year probationary period, Galante wasn't going to do that. So this is what Rizzuto does. Very fucking slick individual. Rizzuto pays Galante a visit, and he asks him to push Violi a little bit, whom he felt had become dead weight and an embarrassment to the family, out of the leadership structure. This is Rizzuto fearing the power Violi has. Violi doesn't like him. He doesn't like Violi. So now he's going to go to Galante, who's going to try to oust Rusty Rastelli and sort of wet his beak and say, help me get rid of this prick over here. It could be very beneficial to us both. And it's reasonable to assume that Galante wasn't really adverse to that idea, because over the next few years, Violi and his associates would be knocked off one by one. So, so while he waited to, Galante basically goes along with Rizzuto and says, all right, yeah, we'll just kill every single fucking one of these people. And so while Rizzuto sort of sat back waiting for things to begin, he returns to Venezuela with his brother Liborio, Pasquale, and Gaspare. Excuse me. Let me read that again. Niccolo arrives, goes back to Venezuela to kind of stay out of the fracas. And his brother Liborio goes, and Pasquale and Gaspare Contreras go with him. And he opens a restaurant in Caracas. And obviously, with a little dark humor, he named the restaurant El Padrino, which is, kind of funny. And he would use that South American place to just kind of hide out there. And he would bolster ties to the Contreras Caruana clan and the Colombian cocaine cartels. His son Vito and family soon made the trip south as well. In 1974, Vic Cotroni gets subpoenaed to stand before the Quebec government's Commission on Organized Crime. He was sent to jail for 1 year in contempt, like we said earlier, because of the testimony. The commission concluded that he deliberately and basically was rambling. He was vague, nebulous, just wasn't going to give them anything. During his time on the stand, Cotroni kept making remarks such as, I have no authority. There are no meetings. There is no mafia. These people are simply my friends. When the commission's lawyer, Guy Dupree, got sort of tired of Cotrone's bullshit. And his inability to remember events suggests that he was acting dumb. And that gaslights Cotrone. And Cotrone starts screaming, "Do I fucking look dumb? Do I fucking look dumb?" And, eventually, Cotrone gets nailed for contempt, but he spent several months in jail and eventually would get out. Later that year, Cotrone and Violi were overheard on a police wiretap, and we talked about this with the Papaglias, basically threatening to kill Johnny Papaglia, demanding $150,000 after he used their names in a $300,000 extortion plot without notifying or cutting them in on the score. In a conversation secretly recorded by the police, Cotrone and Violi had a discussion in Calabrian before Papaglia arrived in Montreal about how best to intimidate him. Violi was enraged at Papaglia for having used the Cotrone crime family name, while Cotrone seemed more relaxed about it, didn't really care. On April 30th of 74, Cotrone and Violi met with Papaglia at the Reggio bar that was owned by Violi. When Papaglia denied taking the money from Toronto stockbroker Stanley Bader while using the name of the Cotrone crime family, Vic Cotrone quite casually told him, "Let's hope so, because we will kill you if you find out otherwise." And we know Papaglia responds with humility. "Yeah, I know you'll kill me. I know you kill me. I believe you will." And basically, by all accounts, Papaglia was just absolutely terrified of Vic Cotrone. On May 13th of 74, at a meeting at the Reggio Foods factory, Cotrone and Violi talked once again in Calabrese, complaining that Papaglia had failed to pay the money that he promised to pay them. Cotrone had a low opinion of Papaglia in general, who he viewed as a coward, saying to Violi that the best way to deal with him was talk slowly, talk very slowly. It's an easy fuck. You'll see he's dumb. The following year, Violi was arrested to stand before the Quebec government's Commission on Organized Crime, and he was sent to jail 1 year for contempt. The testimony heard during the CECO hearings proved damaging to Violi's reputation. One Montreal businessman, Mario Marchettini, testified that Violi's younger brother Francesco threatened his life for opening a pool room close to the Reggio bar that was owned by Violi, as Francesco warned his brother he did not want any competition. Marchettini testified that he went to a meeting with Francesco, who instead of talking began slapping him around in the face. He did it in a very calm way without too much force, but continued to issue threats. All the while, he was giving me advice about how I shouldn't open up there, how it would be bad for my legs. He started hitting me on the shoulders with a 4-foot-long stick used to mix with ice cream. He then kicked me in the face. I was bleeding from the mouth. I had a broken tooth and both eyes were blackened. Marchettini ended up selling his pool room to a Violi associate who promptly shut it down. Another Italian immigrant businessman testified behind a mask at the CECO hearings that he wished to remain anonymous, that he was forced at gunpoint to go into the basement of the Reggio bar to see Violi. He would testify that I was suffering. We were making sacrifices, my wife more than I. Sometimes there were days when we had nothing to eat. I didn't want to sign them, the protection money checks. Paolo had a cigar in his mouth. He told me, "Sign." I hate to admit it, but I cried like a child. I had worked on my business for 20 years, and they ate it all. The businessman stated that his protection money payments ruined his business and forced him into bankruptcy. One of Violi's soldiers, Peter Bianco, who had turned state's evidence or Crown's evidence, basically a rat, testified against Violi. Bianco testified that his area of expertise was robbing wedding presents, saying, "We mostly did Italian weddings. We cleaned out the house while the people were at church." Bianco's testimony was supported by wiretap phone call where Violi is caught calling him and telling his partner Tony Tioli, a pair of no-goods, who had stolen nothing but cheap shit. Another piece of evidence that was introduced during the CECO hearings was a bugged phone call Violi had made to Vic Cotrone in 1973, where amid much laughter, he cheerfully confessed to an attempted murder. As he tells Cotrone, "I shot him in his asshole 3 times. Ha, 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 ha. The papers didn't say it, but I'm telling you it was me with another guy. We went into the apartment. He was sleeping and boom, boom, boom. I shot him 3 times in his asshole. Perfect shot." Violi's only regret was that he failed to kill him, but he took consolation from the fact that the guy still got 2 bullets, or the guy's still got 2 bullets, and he's got 3 assholes now, and they can't take him out. He'll likely remain shitting in a bag the rest of his life. It's worse than being dead. Violi then went on to complain at full length that his 9mm handgun was not large enough, and he wanted a .22 caliber handgun, so the next time that he shot somebody, it would go better. Violi was a braggart who claimed to Cotroni that he committed crimes done by others, and the police knew that this particular attempted murder was the work of somebody else. So Violi's just trying to act tough with Cotroni, and that wiretap put Violi into a dilemma of having to confess to attempted murder or having to confess that he lied to his boss, which under mob code would get him killed. Violi chose the former during his testimony, as he maintained that he actually did shoot the guy. You imagine that? You're so paranoid that you're gonna claim shooting a guy and giving him 3 new assholes, and you know you didn't do it. You're trying to make the boss think you did it, but you're so desperate to appear the tough guy, you're just gonna admit to doing it. Yeah, of course I did it. Of course he's got 3 assholes because of me. So a recording that was made by the RCMP December 73 showed that Violi was confident that his office was not bugged, and he mocked the CECO inquiries, saying they're running around, they're butting in, and their balls are in an uproar because they don't know anything. They can't hear anything. As the recordings were played in the inquiry room, Violi sat looking glum, shaking his head and stunned. What a dumbass. During his own testimony, Violi portrayed himself as the victim and refused to answer any of the questions from the commissioners in a substantial manner. When convicted of contempt, Violi says, "I don't refuse to testify, but I have absolutely nothing to say to anyone in here." It sort of refutes the point. Oh, it's not that I refuse to testify. I'm just not going to talk to any of you. The CECO hearings destroyed Violi's reputation and paved the way for his murder. The way that police wiretaps revealed that Violi kept boasting with hubristic arrogance was that it wasn't possible for the police to wiretap him to make him to be a fool. So in other words, they can't wiretap me. They think they can make me a fool, but they're not. But meanwhile, everything the guy says is being taped everywhere. But these wiretaps would also show him making disparaging and insulting remarks about people in Montreal and people on the commission. And that in and of itself was enough for the commission. Peter Edwards, who was the crime correspondent of the Toronto Star, would end up writing, "The wiretap conversations had shown that Violi didn't measure up to the traditional mafia standards of leadership. He was clearly a braggadocious guy who was indiscreet. Perhaps worse of all, he showed himself to be nothing but a petty criminal who didn't balk at having his soldiers steal from Little Italy brides as he attended their weddings. A man whose actions deprived St. Leonard children of gifts at Christmas time." That hit the papers. Can you imagine the look on Cotroni's face when he sees that? Or even the New York Commission? Ugh. So, with everything becoming chaotic, all hell is about to break loose. 1976 would begin the bloodbath as Violi, was basically against the wall. He wanted Rizzuto dead and anybody who aligned with him. Cotroni, for his part, had been diagnosed with cancer, and he really wasn't in a position to demand anything or fight anything off. In terms of positionally speaking, Violi couldn't wait it out. He could wait it out or he could fire first. He didn't have the gumption to hold on to anything. Very reactive. Rizzuto had disrespected him. Rizzuto had disrespected Cotroni. The commission, who Violi loathed, had disrespected him. Joe Diamond would die in 73, which would usher in Rusty Rastelli. But that wouldn't be easy come, easy go, because Galante is released from prison and blows the fucking doors off Costello's crypt in a "hello, old friend" design. Welcome back to the neighborhood. And Galante backs Rizzuto. So Rastelli heads to prison. That would create, a spot for Carmine Galante to flex his muscles. And Rizzuto, in turn, has to play to the tune of Galante. So, like I said, Rastelli ends up in prison and Galante gets out. And things just kind of get a little fucking nutty. And so when we come back next week, and I know, I said this week would be the end. But next week is the end. And when we come back next week, all hell's going to break loose. People are going to start getting shot. And the blood will run like rivers in the streets. And there will be one last-ditch effort for the two sides to make peace. Even after the shooting, they tried to make peace. But the commission's had enough. And they issue an edict in Montreal. And so when you come back next week, you're going to find out what that edict was and how it would all but end the Cotrone crime family once and for all. So, there you have it. Sorry I laugh about the Violi shit. It's just so stupid and comical to me. You know? They wouldn't dare tape me. I'm too smart for them. Meanwhile, every fucking thing you're saying is being taped. So I hope you guys enjoyed the show. Have a great weekend. And come back for the finale of the Cotrone crime family.